This is a production of O'Brien Communications.
Hi, I'm Tim O'Brien, and this is the Shaping Opinion podcast. In this podcast, we like to talk about important stories, but not all of the things we talk about here make it onto the network news or in the major newspapers that you read. Our guest today is Stacy Malkan. She's one of the reporters who writes the kinds of stories we like to talk about. Stacy is the co-founder and the managing editor at a nonprofit public health research group called U.S. Right to Know. That group covers public health science and it tracks industry lobbying efforts. Stacy has covered everything from how pesticides impact the foods you eat to the health risks of the cosmetics you use. Today, we're going to talk about something else that she spent a good deal of time on. It's called the AGRA program in Africa. That's AGRA. This is a rebranded moniker for the organization. Its full name is the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Stacy Malkan, how's it going where you are?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Tim. I'm happy to speak with you today.
I appreciate you taking the time. It's a busy summer for a lot of people with travel and everything like that. And I'm wondering yourself, you're so busy with work and everything, but do you find a time to get away in the summertime?
Not as much as I'd like to. My son is out of school, so I spend a lot of time with my 10-year-old and just enjoying the weather in Northern California. That's where I'll be this summer.
And you're in Northern California. One thing I've always liked about Northern California is the weather it's always nice. And it never gets super hot in the summer and it doesn't get cold in the winter. So that's one of the beauties of the climate there that I always liked.
Yeah, it is. And where are you, Tim?
I'm in Pittsburgh. So we get all seasons, and we get all seasons hard. So in the wintertime, we get it hard. And in the summertime, this week, it's been 90 degrees in Pittsburgh. So it's been crazy. But and one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was your organization. And I know it's not so much climate change, but we're talking about health. We're talking about things like that. And I mentioned in the intro that you are one of the co-founders of a group called U.S. Right to Know. Tell me a little bit about, not so much about the group, because I think we're going to talk about that throughout the course of the interview, but about yourself. How did you end up founding an organization like that? I know you started in journalism.
Yeah, so I've been doing this for a long time, and I co-founded along with Gary Ruskin U.S. Right to Know 10 years ago now. This is our 10-year anniversary, so we're proud of that. And we're a small but mighty public health research and journalism group. So I've been reading about, studying. I'm not a scientist, but I write about and communicate about environmental health science for the last 25 years now. So I'm just really, U.S. Right to Know is a way to produce good journalism and tell stories about what we're learning about what chemicals in the environment do to our health. That's been a big focus of mine. And we also focus on unearthing corporate corruption and government failures that harm our health. So we've got a lot to cover.
What's the difference between that and journalism for you? Because I know in journalism, they always call it the fourth estate, and journalism's supposed to keep. And this is an issue. I'm in the PR business. I started in the media, and I ended up in the PR business, the traditional PR business over the years. So I've dealt with a lot on my end, and there are certain things that I've always sort of felt were okay in the beginning, and now they're not so much okay. And one for me is this whole fourth estate being the watchdog or speaking truth to power. Those are all high-minded things. But as I've found, journalism isn't necessarily always speaking truth to power. Sometimes you have journalists who want to be the power. And I'm an advocate. And sometimes I feel like when I'm in a room with a journalist, I'm competing with another advocate, and I'm not speaking to someone who's trying to be an arbiter of truth. So that's my sort of observation. It's not, you could call it a bias of mine or an opinion. Now, you've gone from journalism into pure, I would call it advocacy work. And how do you distinguish between your life as a journalist and your life as an advocate?
That's a really good question. And I was a journalist first, and then I worked as an advocate for many years, and now I do journalism and sometimes advocacy. I think about it this way. First of all, your point that the media is unbiased. I mean, that is something that I think we really need to look at. There is no unbiased in media, and a lot of mainstream journalists are primarily concerned with access and position, and that makes it very hard for them to tell stories about power because they're part of the power structure. So that's why independent journalism is so important to us. And I think we need so much more focus on independent journalism. I work with a team of amazing journalists, and they are coming from places like Nature, the Boston Globe, the Guardian, very seasoned long-term journalists. I do more, I want to say, meaning making in journalism. I do write from a point of view, and my point of view is that we absolutely need transparency. We need precaution. We need to take science seriously and understand what it's telling us about our health. And also, we do a lot of looking behind the scenes, under the covers, getting at documents. That's one of the big focuses of U.S. Right to Know, is to do Freedom of Information Act requests. My team is very good at it. And so we've unearthed tens of thousands of pages of internal corporate documents that people never thought would see the light of day. So that helps us to really put together the pieces about how corporations are misinforming the public, lobbying the government, running product defense campaigns. And so we tell those stories. I've done a lot of work of talking about front groups and academics who work hand in glove with industry, often get funding, often it's secret funding. And so that's the work of journalism, but from a point of view, saying the public has a right to know that front groups are taking secret money from companies and they're lying to us.
What do you enable your reporters to do? Let's say they came from these publications like Science or USA Today or other places. You have obviously some experienced reporters and some professionals and some accomplished people on your staff.
Yeah.
What do you enable them to do that they couldn't do at their other jobs?
We enable them to take a long time to investigate stories, as long as it takes to get the story right, and to tell bigger stories, and often to tell stories that other media won't cover. We really, when we started U.S. Right to Know, we wanted to look at what aren't other nonprofits doing and what aren't other media outlets doing. We wanted to work in a space that was uncovered. And that space is huge. There's so many uncovered stories. And that includes deep dive investigations, but also we're doing regular reporting on, we call this our Health Wire beat. It's relatively new, and we're writing about the commercial determinants of health, or how corporations are harming us, and the emerging science showing how products are harming our health. So we have a wonderful reporter, Pamela Ferdinand, who's writing regularly on emerging science that gets almost no attention, but is really important. For example, there was just a recent very large meta-study looking at endocrine disrupting chemicals and how they harm our fertility. And the evidence is so solid over so many years that sperm counts are dropping. Even young women are having trouble getting pregnant. Many serious indicators of alarm for the human population, frankly. And so we're trying to tell stories about let the public know, what the science is showing and what we can see from patterns of now decades of studies and independent research.
It's interesting, the stories that you talk about, and that's exactly one of the points I made in the intro, was that we do cover stories here that you don't necessarily hear other places. Actually, if you look at the media, for as many media outlets as there are, there's almost like only room for 2 or 3 stories a week. And then it changes to 2 or 3 stories next week. So it might be about tariffs or trade or about a war somewhere. Mm-hmm. And then the following week, everybody's covering those 2 or 3 other stories. And stories like the ones that you cover, they don't make it to the top, but they're out there because we wouldn't be talking today if they weren't. Your work's getting out there through the internet and everything like that. And I think there's a certain cultural interest now in some of the things that you're working on and that you write about, for better or worse, because of Robert F. Kennedy. Yeah. He's made this whole banner, "Make America Healthy Again," his thing, and Trump hired him and brought him in, and he's really shaking things up. What's your take in your neck of the woods on the impact that Robert Kennedy's having?
Well, I think Robert Kennedy is an outcome of many years of, as I was saying, science showing how chemicals in food are harming our health, and that if we make different choices in our families, we can see remarkable healing. I think moms. A lot of moms voted for Trump because of RFK Jr. That's a fact, because they're not being listened to by the establishment politicians. And I think that's something that we all should see and pay attention to, the fact that moms are saying no more. You made a really important point about the media. I think of it as it tends to run as a pack. So we see the same 2 or 3 stories, the same opinion points, and so much goes uncovered. And this is why independent media outlets are crucial, because we'll cover a story and sometimes we cover it and cover it and cover it. It eventually makes its way into the mainstream media, where some reporter will pretend they thought of it. That's fine. The point is, you have to lay the groundwork for the truth in order for it to rise up into the levels of media where it gets the public attention. And I think that environmental health, toxins, the perilous situation of our food system are now all at forefront of, I think they could be and should be even more so in the forefront of media attention, because this is an issue that just has widespread bipartisan support. Everybody wants healthy kids. Everybody wants safe products.
You reminded me when you were talking about that, about my daughter-in-law. We have a 2-year-old grandson, and she, like any young mother, she really wants the perfect life for her child, and that includes health and safety and food.
Yeah.
And she has become this food dye police person in our family, and so she'll tell me, I'll get a little text from her every now and then about what foods to watch out for and which ones, not just for her son, but also for all of us. She's become that. I wouldn't call her an activist, but she's definitely very engaged in this, in personal choices that we make. And I do think it's a result of work like people like you do, because it does bubble up. And if it doesn't make it through, actually, a lot of people aren't watching network news anymore. So they're getting it from streaming, from the internet, from documentaries and podcasts. And that leads me to a question, because I mentioned the article, the story that you're covering now, one of the stories that really got my attention and it prompted me to reach out to you. It was something that's happening in Africa, but it's not just in Africa, because it involves a US-based organization. And there's a group called AGRA. They were called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And a lot of these organizations have very altruistic sounding names, a green revolution in Africa. What's not to like about an organization called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa?
Well, thank you for asking about this. This is an example of one of the stories that I've been covering for a long time, in large part because mainstream media is not covering it. And that is the unaccountable influence of the Gates Foundation and Bill Gates. And so AGRA is an organization in Africa that Bill Gates started in 2006. To great fanfare about how his foundation would transform food systems in Africa. And, they do this in a very top-down manner without participation from local farmers, local groups. They built an institution, and an institution that has really pushed particular forms of agriculture, industrial, very input dependent on pesticides, fertilizers, commercial seeds. And not only is AGRA trying to move farmers off traditional farmland in Africa and switch them over to commodity crops, corn, soy, that can be sold on the global market and that really depend on pesticides and fertilizers. But they're also influencing governments across Africa and how they spend subsidies. And independent research showed that governments in Africa, in the countries AGRA works, are spending about $1 billion a year putting subsidies toward fertilizer, toward commercial seeds. And so many critics across Africa have said this is a corporate-focused, not for the people, programs that they've been fighting against for years, and really to deaf ears from the Gates Foundation. So it's really problematic.
It seems like that's a means to an end, and I'm wondering what the end is when I hear that, because you described moving to, commodity crops for the global market. When you say that, it sounds like is the end to feed the people in Africa, or is the end to boost the economy in Africa with cash crops, basically? Or is the end for them to make money themselves?
I think the end result is wealth maximization and feeding investors in the global market, not local people in Africa. It's not helping small farmers. It's not lifting people out of poverty. That's all been documented both by independent research and also the Gates Foundation's own research. You mentioned it used to be called the Green Revolution in Africa, and a couple of years ago, due to the widespread, very loud critiques coming from African groups across many countries, the Gates Foundation rebranded this effort to take out the words Green Revolution, but they're doing the same strategies. And it's just a very problematic structure. We had a webinar just yesterday, and I'll be posting this video soon at usrtk.org. But it looked at the Gates Foundation as a whole, with several global experts talking about how these patterns are not just playing out in African agriculture, but in U.S. education, where the Gates Foundation came in and forced standardized testing without a participation of local teachers, moved policy and changed to the entire U.S. education system to be more homogenized, more mechanized, more easily commodified. We see that also in pharmaceuticals, where the foundation fought to keep patents and keep the COVID vaccine consequentially out of the hands of many people in the global south at a crucial moment. So Bill Gates is a person who's obsessed with monopolies. He's obsessed with patents, intellectual property rights, and many of the activities of the foundation are not only enriching his investments, but even more importantly, really influencing policy. He really presents a very unaccountable, dominant global power that someone who's not been elected, and there's no accountability mechanism. So these speakers yesterday at the webinar were looking at that from many angles and saying that, we've been talking in the United States recently about the word oligarchy. There was a recent study showing that half of Americans think we live in an oligarchy. And we see a lot of coverage of Elon Musk as an example of this. But the point was made yesterday by Timothy Schwab. He's an author who wrote an excellent book called The Bill Gates Problem, who looks at this from many angles. But his point of view was that you don't get Elon Musk without Bill Gates. Gates really laid the framework in the US for using wealth as political power, along with some others on the right wing, I would say, like the Koch brothers and so forth. And they went about it in a different way by funding think tanks to influence policy and write policy. Gates is funding institutions, media, and is really therefore passing and pushing policies that shape global health priorities.
And is the reason that he, and I know you can't speak for Bill Gates, and not that he's going to come on our podcast to explain it, but from your observations or from what you've seen, what other people have said who followed this, why public health? I mean, if you want power, wouldn't you go to Washington and lobby there? Or if you want power in other ways, wouldn't you do like he's done, control the big tech platforms or get into banking? Why would you choose public health, and why of all places would you try to achieve global power by spending so much time and resources in the continent of Africa?
It's a really good question. I wonder. I wish I could ask him. I wish he would be responsive to the public. The Gates Foundation does not really get back to journalists, and Bill Gates is hardly ever questioned with challenging questions. I assume that I want to say that they think they're helping in Africa, but the reason I hesitate to say that is because the Gates Foundation is supposedly very data-driven. Well, the data shows that what they're doing is not working. Hunger in Southern Africa has increased by 30%. Incomes haven't gone up. People are starving. And to move traditional farmers off land, farmers who are growing crops that are nutritious, that are climate friendly, that are adapted, for centuries to the local soil and switch them to uniform commercial seeds and commodity crops dependent on pesticides and fertilizers. I mean, I just don't think you can make the case that that is a good idea. And yet they continue to do it. It's like he can't see another way. And he just said that he's going to be spending tons more money in Africa. Africa is really the last place of undeveloped farmland in the big picture sense. It's the last place that isn't turned over to industrialized agriculture, or the last and largest. So I think that's why the focus on agriculture. The markets want Africa to be part of the global commodity farming system.
Bill Gates owns a lot of land in Africa, but he also owns a lot of farmland in the United States.
Yeah.
And I know that in the United States, the issue there is more cattle and beef as opposed to other things. But there's a pattern. He owns a lot of land, and he's obviously not a farmer. So
Yeah.
he's got his own interests in these things. What's the downside for the people in Africa? What are their biggest complaint? Why don't they just go along with Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation and the other programs? Because it's not all Bill Gates. It's not all the Gates Foundation. It's more than them.
Yeah, it is more than that, but it is really important to point out that they influence other large donors and they influence governments. Their influence is enormous. It's unaccountable. People in Africa are saying, let us make decisions about our own food systems. They're saying we want agroecological systems where we're working with the land, preserving the soil. Our soil is dying. The worst pesticides are dumped here when they're banned in Europe or wherever else. And we don't want these systems. So yet they're having to fight, their own governments, and groups there are making a lot of progress. There is a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of evidence-based work on agroecology as a way forward for African farmers. And I've heard stories where they'll be making progress in government policies, and then in swoops AGRA, and changes things up at the last minute. They're working on seed laws that would, in some cases, criminalize seed saving of local and traditional seeds, or make them not able to be bought and sold. So that's just extremely problematic. Also, we see a lot of funding going into universities and agricultural research. And so the educational resources, the research resources are focused on patentable seeds, genetically modified seeds, commercial seeds, and not on how can we scale up agroecology, how can we have localized food systems. What they're not doing is confronting the structural problems that are behind inequality, poverty, and hunger. And that's what's necessary that's what is going to be necessary to feed the world. It's what's necessary to feed Africa. And localized food systems and local power is going to be a crucial piece of that. And crops that are adapted to the local environment, not these one-size-fits-all, uniform seed systems. In the United States, you mentioned that Bill Gates is the largest, he is, I think it's the largest private farmland owner in the US. And it's not all beef and cattle. It's also potatoes for McDonald's, French fries, and other commodity crops. And when this first came out in the news several years ago, that he was the largest private farmland owner in the US, a lot of people were upset by that, and a lot of people were questioning him. He didn't answer for the longest time, but he finally did answer. I think it was in a Reddit forum, why the farmland? And he said, well, my investment company told me it was a good investment. And then he started talking about biofuels. So just thinking about that for a minute, because a lot of US farmland, the majority is devoted to just two crops, corn and soy, and they're not used as food. Primarily, they're used as food for cows, food for cars, the biofuels, and ultra-processed food factories with the seed oils. And there's damning evidence on how sick the population is getting from ultra-processed food. So this is not a food system. It's a commodity market system making the wealthy people wealthier, while it degrades ecosystems, environments, and makes a fragile, super dangerous, in my view, food system. And we started to see those cracks appear during the pandemic.
Is profit the motive in your mind?
I think that it's a profit mindset. Yeah. And we can't see beyond that. Um,
It's hard to relate. I think most people would look at a Bill Gates, who I saw listed as the seventh most rich person in the world. At one time, he was the largest. He and Warren Buffett, and you just wonder, like, don't they have enough money, or don't they even have enough power? Do that? Why do they need more? Why do they work so aggressively? And Bill Gates basically retired from Microsoft years ago. So to say he's made an impact on the world and has done well is a drastic understatement. But what gets inside the mind of these people? Because you've studied them from a behavioral standpoint in this way. Do you have any theories on what they're really trying to achieve once they've made all the money you could possibly make and had all the power you can possibly have?
I wonder about that, and I want to say I think it's not so much about people, the problem that we have. I think if Bill Gates went away, somebody else would pop up in his place. Same with Donald Trump and Elon Musk. It's the structures that are problematic, and I think it's important for people to understand the structure of U.S. philanthropy. The Gates Foundation has, I think it's a $50 billion endowment. Well, that money is invested in the market. It's making returns at a higher, it's making more money than it's spending. It's basically a tax-free or very tax-light investment vehicle, posing as a charity that gives 5% of its earnings, and that's what is required by law for U.S. philanthropy, away to charity programs. In a lot of cases with the Gates Foundation, those charity programs support the investments. And so it's a moneymaker. Now, he would say, well, it's making money to do good. And other people would say, put the money into democratic hands through taxes, and let's collectively decide how to spend that money for the public good.
That's interesting. Now, when you talk about this whole story about Agra in Africa, how did you first learn about that story yourself? How did it come across your desk?
That's a good question, because I was studying propaganda of the pesticide industry. And we started US Right to Know because we had experienced the intensely overwhelming propaganda game that Monsanto and other pesticide and food companies brought to crush the movement to label genetically engineered foods in the United States. I had worked on a campaign to label GMOs in California, and the Monsanto-led opposition spent, I think it was $45 million in the course of 30 days in the state on very clear disinformation, just blatant lies. But what was shocking about it was that so many different types of people, groups, even scientists and academics were repeating this propaganda. It just overwhelmed, and it tanked the ballot initiative. So we wanted to look into that and understand, how does it work? So we started to put in public records requests on public academics who had been clearly working with the pesticide companies, but saying they were independent. So we did lots of FOIA requests. We got tons of documents showing the very clear patterns of secret payments, of very close collaborations between white coat academics, as a Monsanto PR guy called them, and the pesticide company. So these academics were really running the product defense campaigns for pesticides and GMOs. So this made us not popular with Monsanto. In fact, we eventually found out that they had a 31-page PR plan devoted just to my group, and there were only 3 of us. They had literally 11 employees, 2 PR firms. They were very, very worried about what we were going to find with these public records requests. So before we even started, and this was 10 years ago, just as we launched our group, we were getting attacked by industry-affiliated writers and front groups. And so one of the fronts from that attack came out of the Cornell Alliance for Science. And that was a group started in 2014 by the Gates Foundation. They put in $5 million, eventually $20 million, to this group that was devoted to depolarizing the debate on GMOs, was what they said. But really what they were doing was attacking critics of GMOs and pesticides and training fellows, people across Africa and elsewhere to promote these products. So it was a straight up product defense and promotional campaign benefiting the agrochemical industry, but looking like it was coming from an Ivy League university. They eventually took the name Cornell off the group, and now it's just the Alliance for Science. But they were using the exact same tactics, the same playbook as Monsanto. In fact, they were they were implicated in the Monsanto documents as allies. And so we saw the Gates Foundation coming together with agrochemical industry propaganda campaigns to misinform the public and attack activists. There was a very well-documented case in Hawaii where they were running pretty aggressive, very personalized attack campaigns against activists who were trying to regulate and restrict pesticides in Hawaii. And they started a Hawaii Alliance for Science. So Gates Foundation funding was being used for some pretty nefarious disinformation tactics. And that's what I first started writing about in 2016. And I've since written, I think, almost 24 articles tracking. And then I got onto focusing onto African agriculture.
You reminded me of something more recent. That Doge effort in Washington, it really uncovered a lot of the problems with NGOs too throughout society. It wasn't just people like the Gates Foundation doing this, but it seems to be a way of doing things where if you want to influence, whatever policy or a vote or legislation or just anything, you create this altruistically sounding name and you throw a lot of money into it. It's not tracked. It's not as accountable as government money is. It's not as subject to the Constitution as government power is. So you have a lot of NGOs basically working outside the government, doing different things for different purposes. And it's both sides of the aisle. It's certainly not just your corporate interests working on corporate profits, but it's also, you have these billionaires from all over the world that are trying to influence U.S. policy or make sure that the right people are in power in the United States, and they're doing that. Did you watch this whole Doge thing with a, I don't know, a curious eye with all the experience that you've had and what you've seen?
Well, it's certainly disturbing to see just the randomness and the viciousness of it's upsetting. And then it's also upsetting to think about U.S. government data being turned over to these unaccountable billionaires. Yeah, I think we have a lot of problems. But you're absolutely right that what they're often doing is funding groups that have neutral sounding names or sciencey sounding names, and like the Alliance for Science or Genetic Literacy Project. We really wrote a lot about groups that were working hand in glove with the corporations to push products under the guise of neutrality, which was false. But I do think that these sorts of propaganda campaigns, they're an entire industry unto themselves. And I do think they really show how fragile the power structure is in a way. Like the pesticide companies, for example, they need to rely on propaganda. They have to pay people to attack not just advocates, but journalists and scientists. They do their own studies. They have a very well-oiled machine of product defense and disinformation. And I wrote about that a couple of years ago in a report called Merchants of Poison, because we had access to so many Monsanto documents from our investigation and also the Roundup cancer trials, which unearthed many, many more documents. So I analyzed with my team what those documents showed about how Monsanto was running its product defense campaign. And it's really quite stunning, all of the ways that they have to try to shape public opinion to keep this industrial food system looking like it's working and that it makes any sense.
You mentioned FOIA requests, and that's something I didn't want to let this interview pass by without you explaining that, because I think Freedom of Information Act is the word. Or the words for it. And in order to get certain information, instead of requesting it and government giving it to you because they work for us and it's taxpayer funded stuff, sometimes it's a real challenge to get information from your government, but you do have the right. That's one good thing. And
Yeah.
you have to file these FOIA requests to get information. And that's where you get a lot of the good stuff, which amazes me, because sometimes I think when people are doing things that they don't really want the public to know, they hide it somewhere in government. You have to know what you're looking for, and you have to file these FOIA requests. But in the end, it's amazing what you do find that people put in writing, emails that they probably never should have put in writing, and they did. And now you have even more information. What's it like for you to go through the whole process of a FOIA request?
Well, it's an extremely important tool, and really the United States is ahead of many other countries in having this, the Freedom of Information Act, which is federal, but there are also state laws, and some states are better than others. So my team, and really Gary Ruskin leads this part of the program up, because he's done public interest work for 30 years now, and he knows how to get at the good records. And it takes a long time. You file the FOIA request, you ask for specific things that are from any publicly funded entity. So that could be government, or there are a lot of publicly funded universities. And that's where we were looking at first, and people were not expecting us to look there. And so I think that's why Monsanto was freaking out. And they actually said that our investigation could be damaging to the entire industry. They had a whole grid of responses that they would respond to. One of the options was one tweet from Gary Ruskin would elicit this particular response. 50 tweets in a day, this response. And it was escalating to the point where the entire top pesticide producers group would get together and figure out how to deal with us. So that's just to say, the threat of finding what people might be writing that they shouldn't be writing was very intense for these companies. They really need to control the narrative in order to keep these systems going. So we file the FOIA request, then we wait, sometimes for years, sometimes it takes litigation to get documents, but we work with lots of lawyers who do sue agencies on our behalf to get records. And then you get to pour through a lot of sometimes often very boring documents to look for needles in the haystack. And sometimes it's not too hard to find the scandalous information.
How does it usually work out when you file a FOIA request? Are you pretty confident you'll get what you're asking for eventually?
It really depends on so many factors, which government agency, which law. It's been very hard for us to get records out of California and UC Davis, unfortunately, which is really a hub of the GMO industry. But we were able to get records much more easily out of Florida. And that was the first batch of records we got, because they have better sunshine laws.
I wanted to ask you about COVID, because, that has become, I think that will be studied for decades, COVID in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at it from this whole slice of the process that we're talking about here, and you mentioned the propaganda, but also you mentioned the control, because I know in one of your articles you talked about this in another context. You talked about how the AGRA program, I don't want to say the Gates Foundation, the AGRA program basically wouldn't allow local governments to entertain any other approach than the one they suggested, whether it be this corporate farming, this certain type of crop, pesticides. Anybody that had an alternative solution that was maybe less risky to the environment, better for the soil, better for the people, they didn't even allow that to be heard by anybody. And we experienced this in COVID in the United States. So it's not third world that we're talking about here. And what I'm talking about is I can tell you specifically, I've always sort of been, one of those people that would buy supplements and not try to do supplements or healthy eating as opposed to drugs and going to doctors for things. I'm talking about routine health stuff or remedies. So when COVID hit, I naturally wondered, like a lot of people, if I don't want to, end up on a ventilator if I get this, or what can I do now? What are the things that I can do to help my own body fight off whatever happens? And so you naturally want to learn about things like vitamin C,
Mm-hmm.
Or you want to learn about vitamin D or zinc. And there was one doctor that came up with a program that involved zinc and some other things. Then there was this other supplement that I actually had taken before just for health reasons, and it was called NAC. And I forget how to pronounce it, but the last word is acetylene. So it's NAC. And you had other things like that were just basic supplements. Now, I'm not even talking about hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin. I'm talking about things that you normally could get at the vitamin store. And I went to the vitamin store because I'd read something that this NAC was something when used and combined with zinc and vitamin C, that if your body gets hit with COVID, it'll help your body, mitigate whatever happens. So I wanted to buy some of that. And the person at the counter said all of it was taken off the shelves. It was just not for sale. I tried, and I remember trying to get it through Amazon or Whole Foods, and they totally wouldn't have let you buy it at those large, internet retailers. And that's just one example. And I thought, I can't believe this, because I didn't know. This is still during COVID, so I didn't know what was about to come. This was before the vaccine and everything else. But the vaccine was coming, and that was part of it, I think. So nobody would admit to anything. But what I suspected at the time was, wait a second, they're not letting us treat ourselves. They're coming up with this one-size-fits-all thing that's going to be this vaccine that they're going to give us. But they're not letting us do the other things that you normally would do. It's almost like if they found out chicken soup would help you, they would take chicken soup off the shelves. Anything that was competition for what they were going to provide. I thought of that example when I read your thing about these one-size-fits-all solutions to farming in Africa. Have you seen that pattern beyond the whole Gates Foundation Africa story with just some of the other stories that you've worked on?
Well, certainly. And I want to say that I have to say this, that Bill Gates really was a key factor in how the entire global COVID response happened. So that's just another example of unaccountable power. And it was very much about vaccines. And also he was against waiving patent rights. So that was crazy. But another example from our work is lots of crazy things happened during COVID that were not evidence-based. We decided about, I think it was 4 years ago, to investigate the origins of COVID, because my team felt like they could find crucial information that other people weren't looking for. And they've done an immense job toward getting through the story that there's a lot of evidence that COVID may have come from a lab, and that the initial storyline that it definitely had a natural origin was very much orchestrated by a key group of scientists who didn't want the public looking, who didn't want journalists looking, who just set the story that this was natural and we don't need to worry about it and let's move on. And now over years, we've found many documents showing that even these scientists who were saying publicly that it was just a conspiracy theory that COVID came from a lab were saying privately, gee, this may have actually come from a lab. It's really a stunning story about science used as a propaganda tool. And also another link to the African food example, and just this whole piece of thinking about who controls science and who controls what we know. There's like a fear of the people finding out too much. I think that the elite really put a lot of effort into trying to control narratives, control responses, and decide themselves what they want to do. And it's often for their own enrichment, rather than putting out the science and the evidence that we have and know, and letting the public collective, come to the best decisions.
That's interesting. It is something that will be studied. And did you do a lot on COVID? And what parts of COVID did you focus on when you wrote your stories?
Yeah, so we only worked on the origins of COVID, but we had a big, a robust program on reporting on the origins, and we've won awards for that. We've been recognized by senators. We've been in the New York Times twice, saying that the information that we uncovered as a tiny investigative, nonprofit was crucial to understanding, piecing together the puzzle of where COVID came from, and we still don't know because so much evidence was suppressed in the beginning, some of it by China, and U.S. scientists were not forthcoming either. We may someday know, and we're keeping on looking because there's still information to discover.
It seems like the words common sense come to play, because I think anyone with some common sense, when they first heard about this during the pandemic, and someone said, well, it came from this wet market in Wuhan. And I thought, well, okay, I don't know anything about Wuhan and viruses, so maybe that's what happened. But that lasted about a week. Then somewhere along the line, very early on, they said there was this lab in Wuhan that
Just right there, doing just that kind of research.
Right. And common sense says, well, you don't have to, and I know you do have to in your line of work, be an investigative reporter and go out and find true verifiable facts before you can report something like that as fact. Mm-hmm. But most people, their gut was telling them, wait a second, this is not, what I'm being told is not necessarily the truth. It's something else. There's something that I noticed because, and I've said this to people that I've talked to about it ever since COVID started. I'm not a health expert. I'm a public relations person. I do crisis PR. I've done crisis PR for 35 years, 40 years now. And when I do crisis work and it involves anything related to the health and safety of people, there's a standard approach. It's a standard strategy. You want to make sure that you're looking after the public welfare and the public health first. You want to make sure they know you care about the public health and their safety first, no matter what. That's number one. Mm-hmm. And the third thing, I think, if it's a crisis of any nature like a pandemic, you want to calm the public. You want to make sure there's this, as much as you can, an atmosphere of calm. Not because you want to deceive people, because you know that if they're calm, the other things you have to communicate to them, they will receive and they will act upon. I always liken it to when you're a flight attendant and the plane encounters some turbulence. The passengers do not want to see a flight attendant up there panicking. They want to see the flight attendant calm. They want to hear that the pilot is calm, because they want to be calm so they can figure out what they need to do if the worst happens. Well, what do I need to do? I need to listen. I need to be alert. So when this crisis happened, this pandemic, my gut feeling was we need to, do things and I did do some work for some hospitals and some people that were involved in the pandemic on the front lines. And I always thought, well, we need to calm people. That's our number one order of business. Mm-hmm. And, but what concerned me was the government was taking the opposite approach. It was trying to create panic. Mm-hmm. I could see that. And what I could see, how did it manifest itself? Well, you had people, giving speeches saying there's going to be this winter of death. Mm-hmm. You had these people saying there's going to be 1 million, whatever, if you don't do what I say. If you don't stand 6 feet apart, if you don't put a mask on, you're going to die. And that can be a motivator for some people, but it definitely wasn't calming. Yeah. And I thought, you're going to lose people when you do this from a communication standpoint, or you're going to look like a bully if you have to, if you lay it on the line like this. If you don't do this, therefore this, and it's always the worst case scenario, even if it isn't. Mm. And I wonder how you feel about that, because again, I think in your work, you don't see it from my perspective because you're not a public relations person, you're a reporter, but you see the same things with a trained eye. What did you see during COVID when you saw that there wasn't this effort to calm the masses?
It's fascinating. I mean, like you said, I think people are going to be studying this for many years to come. Lots of aspects of the COVID response The fact that we didn't have any kind of nationwide tracking system because of all the privatized healthcare and separate data. I mean, there's so many fascinating aspects. People have said to us, why do you keep looking for the origins of COVID? Like you said, common sense, like it probably came from a lab, who cares, move on. But we say, well, because, this is a pandemic that claimed how many millions of lives, and we still don't know why it happened. And we're still doing the types of research in this world that could cause, a way worse pandemic. And so things are only getting riskier from here. And we need to understand these systems that you're talking about. Like, what should the public response be? And again, lacking a public response, we had one guy having way too much power deciding what was going to happen when, and really focused on the vaccines. So yeah, I think we'll be hearing about this for many years to come and wondering, but I think the kind of thing you're talking about, like how narratives are told, who decides. Gosh, I wish I could say we were going to figure this out, but the government is getting only more chaotic. Things are getting harder to figure out, not easier.
Oh, it definitely, it concerned me again, and I'm going to leave COVID behind. But before I do, when you had the definition of, the vaccine was supposed to do what we thought vaccines were supposed to do, and then you found out that it didn't really stop spread, or it didn't, it didn't prevent what its promise was.
And they knew that, and they pounded the fear anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And really caused a lot of divisions among society that, again, we're going to be dealing with for years to come.
We sure are, and I pity the people who are in epidemiology and public health sciences, because they lost a lot of credibility among a lot of people when things like that happen. The thing that again caught my attention, because again, I'm not a public health expert, but I am a PR person. And when the vaccine wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, that we learned from the polio vaccine when we were kids, but all vaccines are supposed to do those things. And they changed the definition of vaccine on the FDA website. And I thought, well, that's not a solution. That's a website edit.
Yeah.
It's a solution for something, but it's a PR solution. And you don't use PR to solve a public health crisis. And that goes back, I think, to the common thread of your work, as what you said when you described what you do. Basically, you look at these propaganda programs centered on public health. They all have different purposes, different missions, things like that. What do you see right now? What stories are you covering right now that have your interest?
Well, still covering the Gates Foundation, and I'll be putting out a post with a very powerful webinar with global experts that were challenging the type of unaccountable power that Gates has. So that's coming. I also did recently a fascinating interview with a molecular geneticist talking about what new science is showing about the risks of GMOs and glyphosate and the other pesticides that are being added to genetically engineered foods. So that's an important story, because the science is really evolving, both in genetic engineering, what kinds of traits are being put into plants, but also the understanding of risk through new scientific techniques such as genomics and other molecular profiling techniques that governments aren't using. So we've got a situation where technology is advancing, the science to understand risk is advancing, and the government regulations are literally from the 1990s. So we still have a big conversation to have there about the risk of our food system.
Right now, then, for this week and for the rest, I guess, of this summer, are there any seasonal things that you guys are watching that typically happen this time of year?
Good question. I mean, the anniversary of our COVID investigation is coming up, so we'll be reporting on here's what we found in 4 years. Still digging there, and as I said earlier, still covering the science. Science is coming out almost daily, really clarifying risk, unfortunately reinforcing some things that we've known for decades about harmful products that we're all exposed to, health trends that are concerning regarding fertility and cancers. We'll keep reporting on all of that because I think it's so important for public families to have the information that they can make choices within our own homes. As you were saying, your daughter, I love that story about your daughter telling folks how to eat more healthily, because that really matters for our daily lives. But it's also true that we can't solve these problems at home. We need systemic solutions. We need the government to be involved. We need to take back accountability and democracy somehow in order to get the government reining in corporations and doing obvious things, because there are many obvious steps we can take to protect our health and ensure a better future for our kids.
I just have one more question for you. And you mentioned you have a 10-year-old. Years from now, when your 10-year-old's a young adult, maybe an older adult,
Mm-hmm.
what will you hope that your work has done for the world that they're going to live in at that time?
Well, I hope that we're growing a garden at home, because I think that would be a wise thing for all of us to do. I'm also telling my son to learn the trades and understand construction and how to work with his hands, because I think the world is going to change drastically by the time he grows up. But I do think that young people understand the risks that we're facing. But also they're so distracted by technology that that's a huge concern. So I think we need to all be taking our kids out into nature, helping them to have media literacy, to understand they're constantly being sold to and their attention being grabbed. So we have some big challenges ahead, I think. And it's an exciting time to be alive, though, because I think we have a lot of possibilities within the chaos.
Stacy Malkan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really enjoyed this.
The Shaping Opinion podcast is a production of O'Brien Communications. Copyright O'Brien Communications 2025. Find us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like to watch, go to YouTube, Rumble, or our Substack page, shapingopinion.com.